Well, we've kind of set the ground here, what we wanted to talk about as far as biblical authority. But the next sessions that we're going to be going through, we're going to be looking at very specific areas of kind of arguments that sometimes skeptics like to use against the Bible, how we can answer those things, how we can understand them more fully. And so this topic here is actually called biblical biology. I know that's a change from our listed schedule. However, Pastor Aaron graciously asked me to speak on Sunday morning, so I just kind of did a little bit of a reshuffle with that talk that I'll do on Sunday morning. And so we're going to do this one instead, and hopefully it'll be a blessing, okay? Because you probably didn't know what the other one was anyway, so it's not going to make that big a difference. I shouldn't even have mentioned it. This passage, John 3:12, Jesus is talking to Nicodemus, and he says this very interesting thing. He says, if I've told you of earthly things and you don't believe, how can you believe if I tell you heavenly things? Interesting that Jesus makes this clear statement that the Bible talks about earthly things, the Bible talks about heavenly things, that somehow the belief in one is related to the other. And you can look deeper into this verse and why Jesus said this, all that stuff. But I just wanted to point out that it is true that the Bible talks about earthly things. Yes? Are we doing Q&A? Was that a... Presentation mode. Oh, okay. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thanks. That's good. When I'm not with my wife, I need people to help me, so thank you. It's usually the ladies coming along because I got a collar flipped up or something, so thanks, man. So, the Bible does talk about earthly things. I mean, if God's the creator, he created everything, right? The earth itself and the plants and the people and all those types of things. Because sometimes people are like, well, the Bible doesn't talk about science. Well, of course it does. The study of living things is science. God created all living things. Genesis 1:11, God said, let the earth sprout vegetation, plants yielding seed, and fruit bearing fruit, in which is their seed, each according to its kind on the earth. And it was so. That's talking about biology. The earth brought forth vegetation, plants yielding seed according to their kinds, etc. He says it many, many times. So in this particular session here, we're going to walk through this topic of biology, which the Bible deals with, and show you the current paradigm that's being taught out there, which is belief in the story of evolution. And I'm going to show you some of the problems involved with that. The next thing I'm going to do is show you some scientific evidence for design in biology, the fact that God created that confirms Scripture. And I'm also going to touch on the ethical ramifications of this debate. What happens when you teach a culture that there is no God and everything just happened naturalistically? What are the natural, ethical, things that emanate from that? And we'll start here with a quote from an atheist, a skeptic who was involved in a debate with a Christian on the existence of God. And here's what the skeptic said during the debate. He said, it ties into biology, the most devastating thing that biology did to Christianity was the discovery of biological evolution. Now that we know that Adam and Eve were never real people, the central myth of Christianity is destroyed. If there never was an Adam and Eve, there never was an original sin. If there never was an original sin, then there's no need of salvation. And if there's no need of salvation, there's no need of a Savior. And I submit that puts Jesus, historical or otherwise, into the ranks of the unemployed. Now, if you're a believer here, and I'm assuming most of you are, okay, that's incredibly blasphemous, but I want to point something out. From his worldview, that's incredibly logical. I mean, if there's no Adam and Eve that committed a sin, right, and we were all in Adam and Eve, the gospel falls apart. He's actually very much correct. The problem is he was actually in a debate with William Lane Craig, who holds to theistic evolution, the idea that God created evolution, and the theistic evolutionists are having a big challenge even believing that there was a real Adam. And so here's how the atheists like to attack the Christians who are saying, well, maybe God used evolution. Back to Richard Dawkins, who I mentioned in my last presentation. He says, oh, but of course the story of Adam and Eve was only symbolic. Symbolic? Jesus had himself tortured and executed for a symbolic sin by a non-existent individual? Nobody not brought up in the faith could reach any verdict other than barking mad. See, the atheist figures it out really quick. Well, wait a sec. If there was no first Adam, why do you need the last Adam? And they're talking about the fact that biology has proven that we came from ape-like creatures and evolution's a fact and so on and so forth. So we need to be able to answer this story that they're talking about. And so I want to define evolution for you here in the beginning, just so we can get into a little bit of this, because a lot of times the word evolution is used so many different ways. So if you open up a textbook, you will often see something like this. It's changes in gene frequencies and expression in a population over time. Well, folks, if that's the definition of evolution, I would be an evolutionist, okay? Because I know there's changes in gene frequencies and expression in different things in biology over time. But that's not what people get when they think of the big picture of evolution, you know, pond scum to people kind of evolution. So I want to quote an evolutionist, okay, so not to misrepresent. And this is the evolutionist Kirkut, and he said the general theory of evolution is this. It's defined as the theory that all the living forms in the world have arisen from a single source which itself came from an inorganic form. So in this man's mind, and in most evolutionists' mind, it's like this. At one time on this planet, there was no life. Then there was first life, and from that first life sprouted all the living things that have ever been, including us. What Darwin referred to as this tree of life, okay? At one point, and then it diverges. So keeping that in mind then, a definition of evolution would be something like this. It's a natural process where matter and or energy somehow creates new genetic information. Now this is key to this talk here. We need to understand this. It must be a process where matter and energy just naturally can create new genetic information. Now what am I talking about? We all know about DNA, okay? The language of life. It literally is a coded language system. It's just incredible. And DNA inside us or any biological organism contains all the information for the construction and the operation and the maintenance of whatever creature you're talking about. Plants, dogs, cats, me, you, cows, whatever, okay? So it's the library of genetic information for whatever creature you're talking about. Now, we won't even discuss where this first living thing came from. Okay, let's just say it happened. There are many, many questions we should be asking. If somebody said, well, we just got this first living thing and then it branched out and became all these other things, well, we would have to understand that that first living thing must have had a very small library of genetic information, okay? It must have been very unsophisticated, so to speak, right, for it to come into existence by chance. But it has to have some level of sophistication, and it has to have genetic instructions to pass on to the next generation, or you don't have a living organism, right? So it's got some kind of blueprint that it can pass on to the next generation. It's got some kind of decoding device, because, see, a code is only useful if you've got a decoder. If right now you don't understand English, or you can't hear it, or you don't understand that language, what use is all these sound vibrations coming at you? It's useless. You need a code, you need a decoding device. You need some kind of power plant, some way of extracting energy from the environment, okay? And you need some kind of protective layer to keep yourself contained. That's about the simplest the living thing could be, okay? And you've got to have the genetic instructions to be able to replicate, etc. Now, if the story of evolution is true and you were going to evolve this first living thing, whatever it is, okay, into something like a horse, what do you have to do to the library of this first living thing to turn it into something like a horse over millions and millions of years? Well, you've got to write out billions of letters of genetic information, coded information, for all sorts of forms, functions, and features that the first living thing didn't have. Because things like amoebas, they don't have bones, and they don't have blood, and they don't have hair, and they don't have all of these things that a horse does. So the question for the evolutionist becomes, where did the genetic information come from? What mechanism is just writing coded information for all these sophisticated things that we see on the planet? You see, what evolution would need to demonstrate is things like the stories we get told that somehow, dinosaurs evolved into birds, for example. There's a common evolutionary tale. And we need to start thinking about this because think of it this way. What does a bird have that a lizard-like creature doesn't? Well, there's lots of things. Let's pick on a few here. How about the bone structure? Lizards have solid bones. Birds have hollow bones. It's one of the reasons they can fly. So what changed the genetic coding to go from solid to hollow? You might think, well, that's not a big deal, maybe a little less of something. Okay, well, how about something a little more sophisticated? How about flight navigation systems? Birds can migrate for thousands of kilometers, and they wheel around in flocks, and they don't bump into each other and stuff like that. I mean, you ever walk into the nursery and see a bunch of kids running around? Right? They don't even have bird brains. It's like... And you need to understand, I mean, this is like a GPS system in the brain of a bird, right? It's not like a physical construct. You don't cut the brain, of a bird, or you don't cut it open and go, hey, look, it's flight navigation system. It's like this coding embedded in in the genetics of this creature. It's just phenomenal. What else? How about the mobility? I mean, lizards do this, and dinosaurs, we've seen what they think they look like, and lizards do these kinds of things. Birds are flying. What changed the musculature? What changed the bone structure? What changed all the information to create feathers? And there's many types of feathers. And what about the preening glands and all those types of things? What's writing out all this miraculous code? Anybody here do coding, like computer coding? It's not simple, is it? For you, he's like, hey, yeah, sure, chumpy, I can do this any day. I would say myself, and most people that, code, they understand it can be very sophisticated, and you need, some training to do it. Anyway, what else does a bird have that lizards don't? Well, how about the breathing apparatus? Lizards pant like we do. It's like, birds don't do that. Birds are incredible. If you study them, it's just phenomenal. So they have this, as their lungs are pumping, it's like this one-way jet system. It's just, anyway. I can't do it very well, and I can't fly either. But and not only do they have this one-way jet system, they also shunt their blood in the other direction. It's this cooling mechanism. It's just phenomenal. That's one of the reasons, again, they can fly. It's just incredible, right? So the question becomes, well, yeah, what could have possibly changed all that coding and adaptions and developed all these systems and stuff like that? And here's another question, okay? This would be good for students to think about politely if you're in state schools, to put up your hand, ask with gentleness and respect. But say, what does that creature look like halfway between the process? Like you're not a lizard, you're not a bird. You're like a libird. Okay? How are you functioning as a libird? And why don't we find them in the fossil record? I mean, how are you, how are you getting around as a libird? You're not what are you doing? Right? How are you breathing as a libird? I mean, what's going on? You're not doing that. I don't know, it's like a Lamaze class or something? I don't know, my wife did it a couple times. I never mastered it, but... And some people are like, well, that's just facetious. No, that's science. Those are just plain old logical questions. Excuse me, sir, could you please explain how this creature would be functioning halfway between this transition? Why can't you ask questions? Oh, it's a fact. Did you ever observe it? That's what science is based on. You see, people get convinced of these things, especially our young people, through all sorts of mediums, right? TV shows, movies, school systems, etc. Go on a school trip, for example, you go to the Natural History Museum. This is London has a Natural History Museum. They've got this, place dedicated to Darwin, of course, and you go in and you see all these plaques and information being distributed. I want to show you a couple of the plaques, show you how they do this. One of the plaques there says, Darwin's work supported the view that all living things have developed into the forms we see today by a process of gradual change over very long periods of time. This is what is meant by evolution. Now, you'll notice that they didn't, explain. It's just change. Well, see, everybody knows creatures change. Creationists know things change. Evolutionists know things change because you can observe change in living things. That's not evolution. It's the type of change. What evolutionists need to demonstrate is a type of biological change that adds functional genetic information for forms, functions, and features that never existed before. Not just change. We'll explore that as we continue. And then it says, well, many people find that the theory of evolution does not conflict with their religious beliefs. Well, that's true. There are many religions that can just kind of swallow up evolution, and well, maybe that's the way it works. But if you're a Christian, you've got massive theological problems, and I pointed many of them out in the first presentation, right? I mean, you can't answer the most basic philosophical objection that non-Christians have to the Christian faith, and you all know it. You've all heard it. Here it is. If you've got such a loving God, how come there's so much pain and death in the world? Well, if God used billions of years of pain and suffering and death to create and called it very good, what's your answer? All before Adam sinned. You can't even answer basic questions. So it's interesting to me that over the years what I've noticed is many atheists figured that out. Many atheists went to church. They read the Bible. They went to Bible colleges and seminaries and stuff like that and turned away from the faith. I'll give you an example of someone who figured this out was Jacques Monod. He was a biologist. And he said this. Well, let me set this up. He's in an interview with a Christian who believes God used evolution to create. And this fellow says to him, so you believe God used evolution? He said, yeah. And then he said, well, I'm surprised that a Christian would defend the idea that this is the process that God would more or less set up to have evolution, because the struggle for life and elimination of the weakest is a horrible process. And the Christian hadn't even thought about it. Anyway, back to our tour of the museum here. Before Charles Darwin, most people believed that God created all living things in exactly the form that we see them today. This is the basis of the doctrine of creation. Well, that is not the basis of the doctrine of creation. What the Bible says about creation is God created living things to reproduce according to their kinds. If we were all to reproduce in exactly the form that God had created them, then we'd either look like Adam or Eve. But do we not know that living things change all the time? Of course you do, right? There's a new baby born to the family, right? And oh, look at the baby. You know, she's got mommy's eyes and daddy's ears. And where'd that nose come from? Right? And you're looking in the old photo albums, it's like, whoa, look at great Aunt Fanny. You know, you got the big honker, you know. You know you can inherit half your DNA from mom, half from dad, right? Boom, you do that again and again. It's like shuffling a deck of cards and redealing the stuff, okay? And you get a little bit of this, a little bit of that, and so on. Okay, we know things change, but is it the type of change that adds functional genetic information to turn one thing to another? That's really what the story of evolution needs to show. Now, you will hear a lot about natural selection if you study the story of evolution. And Darwin himself championed natural selection as this kind of superpower that could supposedly do what evolutionists claim, to turn one thing to another. And when he was discussing natural selection, he actually used pigeon breeding as an example. That was, of course, special selection. It wasn't natural. But anyway, he used them as an example to show people how creatures could change. And so he bred all these different pigeons and got all sorts of weird and wacky-looking pigeons. And then he said that's kind of like what natural selection could do. Just weather environments or different food, or whatever could cause creatures to change. Now, most people aren't familiar with pigeon breeding today, so I'm going to use a different type of dog to demonstrate why natural selection can change things but doesn't evolve them. And so what I'm going to use is dogs, okay? How many people here have a dog? Awesome. I love dogs. And if you had a church dog show, you'd see that the dogs don't look the same, right? Okay. Now remember, you inherit all sexually reproducing organisms. You get half your DNA from mom, half from dad. So there's two slots, so to speak, at the same segment in the DNA, okay? And they can be similar or they can be different. Genes we're talking about, like the genes for the color of your eyes or your hair or how tall you're going to be, these types of genetics, okay? So in my example here, I'm going to simply talk about the genetics for the length of the fur or the hair of these dogs. And to do so, we've got 2 slots for each mom and dad dog there. We've got the L is going to symbolize a gene to produce long hair. If that gene gets expressed, the dog has long hair. The S is going to symbolize genetic information for short hair, and some genes work in conjunction with each other. So we're going to say that these 2 dogs have medium length fur. Everybody getting this? Super simple stuff. Biology 101, okay? Okay, so these 2 dogs meet, right? It's a whirlwind romance. They get married. You guys know what's going on. Okay, pretty soon there's more dogs. That's what's going to happen, okay? So what's going to happen with the offspring is they're going to inherit genetic information from mom and dad. Now, it depends on what they get from mom and dad. So see the guy on the far left there inherits the short-haired gene from mom, short-haired gene from dad's got short hair. Guy on the right-hand side, he inherited long and long. He's got long fur, and the guys in the middle, well, they're kind of like mom and dad. They've just got medium-length fur, okay? So let's say they keep breeding, and there's a group of dogs, and they have, a varied amount of hair. Let's say they move up north, okay? And it's late fall, and they move to, let's say, North Bay, where I was born. It can get a little nippy up there, okay? So let's say all of a sudden a storm comes in, right? Boom, and it's this freezing cold storm, and this is natural selection now because the environment is going to start selecting from what's in the gene pool here. So winter socks in really quick. What happens to the short-haired dogs in the winter? Unfortunately, they can't survive, okay? What happens to the medium-length furred dogs in this very cold environment? Well, they're going to get out of the area as quick as they can, maybe go down south, okay? Leaving behind dogs with long hair because they can survive in the environment. They actually might move up even more north than the parent group did, right? And get cut off even more. Now, this group is going to keep reproducing, but they can only pass on the genetics that they have. So what does the next generation have? They've all got long hair. Now, the evolutionist is going, wow, look at these creatures are adapting to the cold. But the informed creationist should be going, excuse me, is there any new genetic information that wasn't here in the parent population? No. You see, now, by the way, I know some of you probably study biology, and it gets way more complicated than this, okay? You got jumping genes and dominant and recessive, and I know, okay? I talk to scientists, and they bore me sometimes. But anyway, the point I'm making is still the same, because if the short-haired gene somehow slips through and gets expressed up in this cold environment, that dog will get wiped out of the population, and eventually you'll only have dogs with the long-haired gene, okay? So let's look at what happened here, because this is an example of natural selection. And let's look at the pictures. Let's look at the pictures at the top, and let's look at the pictures at the bottom, okay? And we're going to ask 2 questions. First one's really easy to answer. Question number 1 is, look at the dogs at the top, dogs at the bottom. Have the dogs changed? Yes, because the pictures are different. That's the big clue, okay? Question number 2, have the dogs evolved? No, because the dogs at the bottom don't have any more genetic information than the dogs at the top. They don't got any new stuff, okay? They don't have wings. They don't have, echolocation. They don't have anything new. They've actually got less genetic variability than the parent population. See, we've been doing dog breeding for years. I told you I love dogs, and I've got 3 children. I got 10 grandkids now, which is kind of fun. But anyway, my 3 kids growing up, they like dogs. And this was my oldest daughter, Alicia's dog, a Great Pyrenees, okay? Caleb, his name was. Not the cat, that's just a snack. I'm just kidding, okay? All you cat lovers out there, I always get you. Like that, the inhale and everything. That guy said he fed his dog cats, I think about it because I don't like cats, but anyway, never did it, just joking, okay? Now, my son, he wanted his own dog, okay? And he got Abby. Now, Abby was a German Shepherd cross. She had springs in her feet, super fast dog. And you guys know where this is going because I have 3 kids, right? Yeah. My youngest daughter, she couldn't save a dime, okay, until she said, I want a dog. And Angie and I looked at her and said, you're going to have to save up for it because we're not buying it for you. She saved up every nickel. And she got this thing. Don't give me the aw. And you know what? She called him Greg. What kind of dog name is Greg? I was living in Guelph at the time, and I would open the back door, and he's, and he goes out in the back, all these high fences, and then I got to call him back in. I'm like, Greg. My next door neighbor's like, man, who's Greg? Anyway, sorry for the rabbit trail. But the point is, you could see the variation within the dog kind right there in my front yard. God created kinds of creatures to reproduce according to their kinds. If any of these dogs could get together, what would they produce? A dog. A variation of a dog. I mean, think about it, folks. The story of evolution says one kind morphs into another over millions of years, a slow process. But as far as science goes, the Bible says creatures reproduce according to their own kinds. Who's winning the observational science war? We are. I mean, is there anybody here that's actually seen a dog or a cat give birth? Anybody? Yeah, somebody? Yeah. Was it a dog or a cat? Sorry? Dog, okay. And did she have more than one pup? Yeah. And did they look a little different than each other? Yeah. So when you saw her give birth, right? So when she was giving birth or were you kind of like, man, I wonder what's going to come out? You probably weren't doing that. You know why? Because dogs make dogs. So if you want to believe that one kind has turned into another kind over millions of years, I respect your faith. But don't call it observational science. Don't call it science and gaslight me into thinking that I've got to believe what the science says. My first granddaughter on Caleb. I had to throw that in there. Anyway, see, the point is that we see variations of dog kinds all over the world. Look at the dingo in the top right corner. When I went to Australia, I saw the dingoes and I thought, man, that looks a lot like Abby. The coloration was different and stuff like that. But we see these similarities, and some have big ears, and some have short ears, and some have long tails, and all these kinds of things. I mean, you can even get fluffy here, right? It's pretty tough. But the fact is, we see all sorts of variations of the dog kind all over the world. And, when we talk about purebreds, you know how we talk about, oh, that's a purebred dog? Really, it's an inbred dog. You know how they make these things, right? They go, wow, that's a neat trait. Hey, that one's got that same trait. Let's make them mate. Hey, look, the offspring. Some of them have that trait, and you keep focusing those genetics. That's how you get teacup poodles, and you get Great Danes, and you get all this variation, but we call them purebreds, right? That's why they have so many genetic problems, actually. A lot of purebred dogs have problems, if you know, right? So, you think about it, you got to feed these things heart pills and, bring them to the vet and, all this kind of stuff because they're so fragile. And the local, mutt, you back it out of the driveway, you drive over the thing, it jumps up, like, because it's this robot dog, right? Anyway, now, if you guys got a weak stomach, okay, you might not want to look at this because I found the worst example of an inbred dog I've ever seen. So if you're a little sensitive, just, might want to turn away. I'll be here all day tomorrow, folks. Anyway, let's get serious again. Interesting, if you look at the evolutionary literature, they actually reveal this stuff. Okay, even though there's a story that they're if you look at the hard data, for example, Science Magazine had an article called Genetic Evidence for an East Asian Origin of the Domestic Dog in Science Magazine, and they said this: the origin of the domestic dog from wolves has been established. And then they said, we examined the mitochondrial DNA sequence variation among 654 domestic dogs, representing all major dog populations worldwide, suggesting a common origin from a single gene pool for all dog populations. Do you know what they just admitted? If you guys had your dog show, and they all those weird and wacky looking dogs, you know where those dogs came from? Wolves. Which means wolves were probably a lot more like the original dog kind that God created and then got off on the ark and got off the ark. Because you can get all that variation from just wolves. Think about that. It's incredible. Now, Science Magazine had the article, and then National Geographic will often follow up with that. National Geographic, that great faith-building magazine. That was sarcasm. Anyway, article, very interesting, called From Wolf to Woof. And they called it the evolution of dogs. Hear what they're saying? The evolution. It went from that to that. Are you evolving? No, you're devolving rapidly. Think it through. You guys ever seen a wolf up close? Like you lock eyes with it and it looks and you're like, whoa, like, look at the thing at the bottom. It looks like it's afraid to be alive. Right? It's not evolving, folks, okay? It's got less genetic variability and needs a lot of heart pills. Now, from the article, watch what they admit in their own words. Genetic studies show that dogs evolved from wolves, they use the same word again, and remain as similar to the creatures from which they came as humans with different physical characteristics are to each other, which is to say not much difference at all. Now think that through. Look at the variability just in the audience we have here. But think what they're saying. I can go to Africa. I can go to Australia. I can go to New Zealand. I can go all around the world. And I see variations of people. And they're just people, right? And dogs are just dogs, right? And God created kinds of creatures to reproduce according to their kinds, right? What does science show? That the Bible's true. See, we like to illustrate it as the creation orchard. The fact that God created certain kinds of creatures, and you get variations. Look at the first tree there. You can get all sorts of dog kinds, but they all started with one body of genetic information, and you just get variations of that. We do not observe this evolutionary tree of life occurring. Now, understand that you do have to stick handle through some arguments, okay? So, for example, you'll hear evolutionists say, oh yeah, but what about pesticide resistance? What about these cases where we've got these swamps and there's mosquitoes, and so we go in there and we spray our DDT, right? And then we kill the mosquitoes, but then we come back and then there's new mosquitoes and they've evolved resistance. That proves evolution. Well, I like to explain it this way. Long before the last 2 years, okay, when people are practically bathing themselves in this stuff now, I would sometimes use this because I'd be out speaking, and often, like, I go to all sorts of different churches. I remember one church where the pastor wanted me to shake everybody's hand on the way out. That was just the way they did it. By the way, I'm not doing that here. But anyway, no, but because I was on the road so much, right, I would often get a cold, right? It just happened, And so I'd be buying this stuff, and I'd look at it, 99.9% of germs. Like, I'll pay an extra toonie. Like, I'm in Shoppers looking around, like, just one that kills them all. I'm going to be the guy, hey, thanks for coming, sir. Really appreciate that. Wipe my nose, get a cold. But they can never make one. And it gives you insight into this whole insect resistance argument. See, what happens is you walk into the swamp, and you spray your DDT, and you kill about 99.9% or whatever the percentage is, right? And there's a certain group of them that already have resistance to your poison. You know how we know that? Because they didn't die. It's pretty scientific. No, they can actually take them and go in and look at all the genetics and say, this is what's causing the resistance, right? So those ones that survive then procreate, and they pass on the genetic resistance, and so you come in and you're like, wow, new skin, and you use it, and they've all got resistance. And the evolutionist is going, see, they evolved resistance, and the creationist should be, excuse me, sir, if the parent population already had resistance in it, how can you claim this as evidence for evolution? So watch out for those types of arguments, okay? Walter Veith holds the chair of zoology at the University of Western Cape. In one of his lectures, he said, the very name selection implies that you're choosing between two or more variants. Natural selection never increases the number of variants, it only decreases them. So how can a mechanism that makes less and less end up making more and more? Natural selection is not a creative process, it's a selective culling process is what it is. It can cause change, but it doesn't evolve anything. That's why shortly after Darwinian evolution came to prominence, then they started talking about neo-Darwinian evolution because they needed something new to supposedly create all the new genetic information, and they used mutations as their supposed form. Now, if you don't know what a mutation is simply a spelling mistake when DNA replicates, usually. And it's like spelling errors that can occur. There can be many ways that can happen with radiation and stuff like that. But your DNA is just this long, stretch of letters, And sometimes when genes are copying, we live in a sin-cursed world, they don't perform perfectly, and you get errors. You might get a letter removed, or you might get them mixed around or switched or changed backwards. There's all sorts of different mutations that can happen, spelling mistakes, okay? But can spelling mistakes actually cause and write new genetic information for forms, functions, and features that never existed before? What do we observe when we observe mutations? It sounds really cool when you're, a comic book nerd like me when I was growing up. You get a mutation and all of a sudden you can shoot laser beam eyes or you get claws, It's really cool until you find out what a mutation is, and you're like, I don't want none of those, because they can cause a lot of disease, sickle cell anemia and all these problems and stuff. So what they're now saying is like, okay, let's say I take a book, Little Red Riding Hood, right? And I hand it to the first gentleman there and say, could you make me a copy of my book? So you copy off of my book, and then you hand your copy off to the next person. Copy. And as it's going along here, you guys are going to make some spelling mistakes, right? That's what's going to happen. But what the evolutionist is saying is if we start with Little Red Riding Hood here and we keep making spelling mistakes, by the time you get it over here, it's the works of Shakespeare. Think it through, what they're actually professing happens. What do we observe with mutations? Some people say 2 heads are better than 1, right? But the information for a head was already there. You can do that with pineapples too. Here's an example where someone's hand, the DNA, it didn't complete the series it was supposed to, so some of the fingers are fused together and they've got 6 fingers, right? Sometimes you can get deletions with DNA. It's kind of like writing out an email and you're like, I didn't like that. You highlight it and you delete it from the program, or you hide it, right? Same thing. We can get creatures with melanin. Now they don't have any melanin. We see things like octopuses, except that's a hexapus. Right? And he didn't get 2 of his arms bitten off. It just didn't work well. Any fishermen here? Anybody like to fish? Yeah? Okay, you're going to love this mutation. Look at that. Twice as many chances to catch that guy. It's awesome. Right? The problem is this isn't new information. It's a genetic defect. It's like a photocopy glitch, right? It's not a positive thing. As a matter of fact, in an effort to observe mutations that cause evolution, so they can observe evolution, they will take lab animals like mice and they irradiate them. They zap them with radiation. What happens? Well, they get cancer. Cancer's, a mutation. They get fruit flies, they zap them. What do we see? Well, we get fruit flies with crumpled wings, fruit flies with no wings, fruit flies with their legs growing out of their eyes. You know what we never see? Fruit flies changing into butterflies, or else anything other than just a messed up fruit fly. You're just taking what they have and you're messing it around. Now, again, you got to be aware that there's arguments out there you got to go through. One example would be things like, well, what about bacteria evolving resistance, right? So this is a little different than the other thing we were talking about with pesticide resistance. For example, H. pylori. That's a bug that if you get in your stomach, doctors are going to want to do something about it. It can cause stomach ulcers, stomach cancer, that kind of thing. How do we normally treat this in the medical world? Well, we apply an antibiotic. Now, the antibiotic actually takes advantage of a natural enzyme that's within this bug, okay? And that enzyme gets converted into a poison, and that's actually what takes care of the bacteria. But sometimes you get a mutant H. pylori. And what's happened is, of course, you don't know it's a mutant. You apply the antibiotic. It worked last time. Why wouldn't it work this time? But it's had its enzyme removed. That's not enough to kill it. It just used to have something. Now it doesn't have it, okay? It's been deleted from its program or not expressed. And now the bacteria survives. And the evolutionist says, look, it evolved resistance. And again, the creationist, well, excuse me, if it doesn't have the enzyme, now it's lost something. That can't be proof of evolution, which by definition requires new things. You see how that works? Dr. Lee Spetner, brilliant geneticist, wrote a book in 1997 called Not by Chance. I know that's a while ago, and there's been much scientific study since then. But at the time, he said not even one mutation has been observed that adds a little information to the genome. And since that time, there has not been one smackdown case that an evolutionist can present showing, look, brand new genetic information that never existed before for something new. But even if they could, This is actually a statistical argument. In order for evolution to have been true, it would have had to happen billions and billions and billions of times. And we don't even have one example of it. So a lot of times, how people get convinced of the story of evolution is through equivocation. Where the teacher's, well, I see evolution happening in my lab. It's a fact. And he's talking about the changes, the variations within kinds. But little Johnny thinks it's proof that we evolved from pond scum to people over millions of years. Let's talk about biology and the Bible. Let's talk about Romans 1:20 for a second. For his invisible attributes, namely his eternal power and divine nature, have been clearly perceived ever since the creation of the world, in the things that have been made, so they are without excuse. This verse basically implicates everyone on the planet. No one will stand in front of God on Judgment Day and say, well, there's no evidence of you. This verse says you can know that God exists because of the creation, because of what God made. Which, by the way, for the theistic evolutionist, I mean, the person stands in front of God and says, well, I didn't see any evidence that there was a creator. Even my Christian friends said that, things just look evolved. But that's not what Scripture says. So the fact is, you kind of have to get this beaten out of you, and you kind of get tricked sometimes by having facts presented to you and then interpreted. Things like this. Okay, class, we're going to learn about evolution again today. So let's look at these limbs of these creatures here. Let's look at the humans, and we got the horse, and look, one bone, 2 bones, 5 digits. Look at the other one, 1 bone, 2 bones, 5 digits. Look at the other one, 1 bone, 2 bones. Isn't it obvious that we all evolved from a common ancestor? Yeah. But you can interpret facts different ways. How many people think that the unicycle evolved into the Porsche? People say, Cal, that's a ridiculous argument. Oh, okay, I stand, ready to be stand corrected. What's ridiculous about it? Well, look, it's obvious that an intelligent designer would use common, principles in a variety of different applications. That's a really good argument for the top diagrams. Isn't it obvious that an intelligent designer would use similar applications in a multitude of creations? Why do they always use it as proof of evolution? It's the same facts. Did you observe one turn into another? No. Is it common descent or common design? Common designer. We can look around the natural world. We can see things like bee orchids, for example. You're looking at a plant right now. It's pretty cool. This plant is obviously shaped like a bee. Not only is it shaped like a bee, it's also colored like a bee, okay? And not only is it shaped and colored like a bee, it's also fuzzy like a bee. Bees are fuzzy. And not only is it shaped and colored and fuzzy like a bee, it also smells like a female bee in heat every now and then. Produces a pheromone that attracts bees. Very interesting to see how this plant reproduces. You can see the side view here, you can see the labellum. That's the place that looks like the bee. It's fuzzy and looks like the bee and stuff like that. And we're going to keep it PG here, but these plants both have female and male parts. Enough said? Okay. But, you can see the stigma there, the female part, and then you see the pollinia. That's the shaft with the seed in it there. That's the male part. And so how do these plants reproduce? Well, Mr. B's flying along one day, and he's like, perfume. And he looks down, and he sees what he thinks is a female bee. And so he goes, whoom. And when he lands, the way he mounts, his head comes into contact with that pollinia. Now, that pollinia has a special glue on it and a detaching mode, so it goes, and it sticks to his head. And he backs out, and he's got this thing stuck to his head. He's like, man, what's her deal, right? Not only does it have this glue in this release mechanism, it also has a mechanism that then bends it down to a 90-degree angle. So he's flying around with this weird thing on his head, weird chapeau. But, guys, same one-track mind. He's like, hey, perfume, huh? Right? And he sees what he thinks is another female bee. So the way he lands, that thing inserts itself into the female part, and you get a bunch more plants. Evolve that. Folks, how does a plant, it's got no eyes, it's got no brain, it's It's not going, hey man, I should make myself look like a bee. I should color myself like one. I should make myself fuzzy. It's not feeling things like, oh, I should be fuzzy. You know, oh, I need to smell like a female bee in heat. It doesn't have a chemical kit. It's not sitting there, well, that smells like a skunk. Oh, perfect. You can know God exists because of what he created. The evidence is all around us. There is no excuse. That's not enough for salvation. All it is enough evidence to show that God exists. And then you look at your sin and you realize you are a sinner. And you've offended God. And you need a Savior. Look at this short video. I actually had one of these creatures for a brief period of time. It's called a mimic octopus. I'll just play the video and you guys can check out God's creation. Just a short video here.
Unknown until it was spotted, first by fishermen off the coast of Indonesia in the 1990s. It looked like an octopus, but it could morph its shape in an instant to appear as seemingly any animal around it. At first, no one had any idea what it was.
The first time I saw it, I just was blown away. You couldn't get a more spectacular animal. It really is the pinnacle of wizardry.
Biologist Mark Norman was the first scientist to study this seemingly shapeless creature. He named it the mimic octopus.
The mimic octopus makes itself look like a living, moving animal. So it pulls all its arms around behind its body and swims along like a poisonous flatfish called a banded sole. In other cases, if it's getting attacked, it puts 6 arms down a hole and raises the other 2 arms to look like a poisonous sea snake that has bands along its body. If that's not enough, it'll swim along looking like a poisonous lionfish with these banded arms looking like the banded spines that come off these very deadly fish.
So far, 15 separate species are known to be in the mimic octopus act, and Norman is not always sure exactly what the mimic is doing. He observed this mimic scuttling along the sea bottom, looking something like a furry turkey with human legs.
Sometimes it's hard when you watch a mimic octopus doing what it does to interpret what's going on. It's a bit like looking at ink spots in a psychiatrist's office going, I don't know what that is. It could be a piano, it could be a fridge. So you get 3 or 4 divers together and you'll argue all night trying to work out what we think it was mimicking.
Where did nature's greatest actor come from?
I love playing that clip because I've seen it so many times. But from my perspective, as I'm watching your faces as you're looking at it, it's a delight. It's like, you know, I'm sure I did the same thing. I'm not mocking. I'm just saying, isn't it cool? Isn't that an amazing thing God created? I had one. I saw that video, wrote an article about it, and thought, I wonder if I can get a mimic octopus. Went down to my pet store in Cambridge, asked the guy, he's like, sure, I can check. He sent an email to some guy in Indonesia who jumped into the water, grabbed one, mailed it to Canada in a package. Poor little guy. Got there, and I had him for 9 months. They don't live that long. He only mimicked once because octopus are predatory, and so if they have other animals inside the tank, they either eat them or get eaten. And when I took Morph, because that's what I called him, and I poured him into the tank, he went, and he turned into a jellyfish, and he went, and he got down to the bottom, and he hid for 3 days, which was what I was told he would do. Because when he hit the top of the water, he didn't know what predators were down there. So he turned himself into a poisonous jellyfish. And mimic octopuses are incredible. Like they said, they can mimic up to 20 different things. So think about it. This little tiny octopus with this little, I don't know how big the brain would be, but it has a data bank of information saying, I'm in this environment, I need to turn into this now. Oh, this thing doesn't like that, so I'm going to make myself into a snake, because those don't like snakes, but these things don't like that things. And then they have to be able to make their body go into that position. And then they have to make their movements like that. And they have all that database, and they don't learn it. Baby mimic octopuses don't sit in the corner going, hey, look what that guy did, I'm going to practice. Right? They don't do that. They got that whole file, boom, right there. So that's a fantastic question the narrator ended with there. Well, I ended it there because I thought it was a good place to. Where did this greatest mimic come from? Ask the birds, and they'll teach you. The birds of the heavens, and they'll tell you. Or the bushes of the earth, and they will teach you. And the fish of the sea will declare to you. Who among all these does not know what the hand of the Lord has done this? See, many people in rebellion, you can read about it in Romans, they just don't want God to be true. They don't want God to exist. It's not scientific. They've got all this stuff. It's a skin of reason stuffed with a lie. Sure, they've got all sorts of arguments and graphs and charts, and I know I've dealt with many of them. But I thought this was one of the most honest quotes I've ever seen from an atheist, Thomas Nagel. He said, I want atheism to be true, and I'm made uneasy by the fact that some of the most intelligent and well-informed people I know are religious believers. It isn't just that I don't believe in God and naturally hope there is no God. I don't want there to be a God. I don't want the universe to be like that. It's not science, folks. It's a story. They're telling our kids a story, not science. So let's finish off with this. How important is this whole topic? I talked to Christian. Who cares? Creation, evolution. Maybe God used evolution. Well, I've shown you the theological implications. But think of it from the atheist position. No God. Interesting that Richard Dawkins will make statements like this. I'm a passionate Darwinian when it comes to science, when it comes to explaining the world, but I'm a passionate anti-Darwinian when it comes to morality and politics. Why would he say that? Because he's a well-informed, intelligent person. And he knows what happens to societies that apply social Darwinism, survival of the fittest. Who's the fittest in our country right now, folks? Have we figured it out over the last 2 weeks? Of course, he flip-flops and says, well, we live in a universe which has no design, no purpose, no evil, no good, nothing but blind, pitiless indifference. Well, if that's true, who cares? There's the strong and there's the weak, and you cull them out. Who cares? Right? No good, no evil, no right, no wrong. Think about the society we're living in right now. Who makes the rules? Are there rules? Do the rules change over time? If it's just people making up the rules, of course they're going to be arbitrary, right? Think of what you're saying when you say to somebody, and we've all done it, that was wrong. You know what you're actually stating here? Look, there's a moral law. You know it, I know it, and you just broke it. That's what you're saying. That's what you're communicating when you say to somebody, that was wrong. But moral laws come from moral lawgivers. And if there's no God, who's the moral lawgiver? Oh, man? I actually argued with an atheist one time, and he said, well, societies, they're the ones that make up the rules. I said, oh, so Hitler was right then. Because that's the way the Nazis actually argued in the Nuremberg trials. They said, in this country at this time, it was law. We could do this to these people. That was law. It was right because of the law. And the people argued, no, there's a higher law, God's law. So the conclusions here is that evolution's main arguments, biological evolution, absolutely fail. Natural selection, genetic mutation, there's no evidence of things evolving, okay? We don't have observable evidence of that. There is ample evidence for intelligent design. Repeatable science confirms biblical creation, right? There's nothing in science that goes against it for certain. And the moral implications of evolution, which means there's no God, has not been positive for society. Look at some of the greatest atrocities we've ever seen. Stalin, Lenin, Mao, Pol Pot, Hitler, all these people. I don't know if you've read Mein Kampf, but Hitler was a staunch Darwinist, right? That's the whole concept. Higher races, lower races. We're going to talk about that tomorrow. We're going to end there and let you get some sleep. But before we go, just like to point out a couple of resources. Over the last 2 years, we have developed quite a catalog of video content because I just wasn't able to go out and present. So you should check out our Answers in Genesis Canada YouTube channel. So there's an Answers in Genesis US, Answers in Genesis Canada. Would appreciate you going there. Check out some of the content if you like it. Do everything every YouTuber says. Subscribe, ring the bell, do all that stuff. But it really does help because it brings up the algorithms and gets it out to many more people. And also, we've got a brand new program called Answers to Go. You know, a lot of times you talk to especially busy moms and dads. I remember when my kids were little, I just didn't have a lot of time. So this Answers to Go program is specifically designed for people on the go, right? We look at Ephesians 5:16, walk not as unwise, but as wise, making the best use of the time because the days are evil. You want to learn more about apologetics, more how to defend your faith, more how to share the gospel more frequently? You just go to answerstogo.ca. There's a couple of courses you can take there. You click on it, and we'll actually send you a pre-selected group of videos. Some are like 60 seconds long, right? Some are 5 minutes long. So the idea is, oh, you're waiting in line for coffee, and you're about 4 deep. You know it's going to be at least a minute. Boom, listen to a video. Get equipped. Oh, you got 5 minutes waiting for your dentist appointment? Boom, get equipped. You're traveling, right? You know, ladies give the honey-do list, guys. It's on the weekend, right? Stick on your headphones. Listen to a longer session. Imagine if you had this session and you could just listen to it a couple of times just in your car when you're commuting, etc. That's the whole idea of Answers to Go. So please take advantage of that as well. Okay, we're going to end here, and I'll get these folks to come back up and give us some instructions and when we're starting tomorrow and stuff like that. Hopefully this was encouraging for you. There will be brand new material tomorrow for 4 more sessions. So have a great night, folks.